I think. Good afternoon. Yes, go ahead. Okay, sorry. Good afternoon to everyone, and we are going now to start our third part. And first of all, I have to inform you that unfortunately Daniele Ceschini is not with us. He's ill, and so we are really very sorry because his paper covers the Italian situation, and so okay, maybe we can. I hope he will be well very, very quickly, and we just can go on. And the first one of this afternoon is Gorazd Bajc, who will, Gorazd, just his lectures contemporary European history, focusing particularly on the history of the Balkans. He works as a researcher at the Institute of Nova Revia for Humanities, Ljubljana, and at the Institute of Koper, Capodistria. Today, Gorazd will speak for not more than half an hour, 35 minutes, about violence against women in Trieste in the first period after the Second World War. Please, Gorazd, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. In my contribution, I will address two topics. Firstly, I will present numerical data of violence against women in the first post-war period in the area of Northern Adriatic or Primorska, the cities of Trieste or Trieste, Gorizia or Gorica, Monfalcone or Tržič, and in the province of Udine, Vidar. After the Second World War, the situation in the region was tense because its affiliation remained unspecified. Italy wanted to retain as much territory as possible, and Yugoslavia wanted to obtain as much as possible. For comparability, I will also mention the most relevant figures of violence against women in the area east of Primorska, that is in Slovenia, in the first post-war period. In the second part, I will present two case studies of violence against women in Trieste. It should be emphasized that I have not dealt with family-related cases of violence against women, or with cases of rape or other forms of crime. My focus was purely on political violence. So, there were several subcategories of political violence which women were subjected to after the war. In Venezia Giulia, from the chronological point of view, we must first address the violence by the Yugoslav authorities who, on the 1st of May 1945, liberated and occupied the disputed area of Primorska, which led to several persecutions, in particular, executions and deportations. According to Nevenka Trocha, for Trieste and the surrounding area, a total of at least 601 persons have been identified as having been either killed or died in captivity, among them 19 women. 901 people were killed or died in captivity in the area of Gorizia, and among them were 49 women. We have the least information about the Foibe and deportations from Istria. And the Fiume, sorry. About 850 people were deported, of which 670 never returned. There is no information about women here. We also do not have accurate data on how many women there were among the deportees. According to some information, there were 3. Then, violence after June 12th June of 1945. After 12th June of 1945, the Yugoslav side had to withdraw from the western part of the disputed territory. In the eastern part, that is in Zone B, Zona B, Zona B, sorry, in Zone B, the Yugoslav military administration remained in charge. Although there was much emigration of the population, the so-called Esuli, in total they were about 200,000. There is no verifiable data on political violence here, even in relation to women. In the western part, in Zone A, Zona A, in Zone A, the Yugoslav Political Police or Security Service, the OZNA, since 1946 called UDBA, was very active. They separately kidnapped some political opponents. They were predominantly Slovenians. From October 1945 to September 1949, there were 10 such cases, and among these there were 2 women. Okay, in Slovenia, in the first post-war period, most of the executed after the war on the soil of Yugoslavia, especially in Slovenia, were the returned or captured enemies, especially members of formations of collaborators. According to the Ljubljana Institute of Contemporary History, in Slovenia, 14,999 persons died as a result of post-war executions. Of these, the overwhelming majority were the domobranci or Slovenian Home Guard units. 11,771. The remaining 2,199 were civilian casualties. We do not yet know how many of the executed civilians were women. We can safely assume that a considerable amount of said executed civilians were women, given that during the war most men had been mobilized in one army or another. About other executions. Data on other executions of women in Slovenia in the first post-war period are incomplete. Here, at least, we can mention the fact that 3 nuns were liquidated. Regardless of the justified or unfounded reasons for death sentences and the execution of sentences, let us consider the following data regarding executed women in the trials. Of the 153 executed persons from verdicts of military tribunals between 1945 and 1952, 6 were women, 5 were executed in 1945 and 1 in the year after. Following the verdicts of civil courts between 1945 and 1952, 6 women were executed among 134 total victims, 3 in 1947, 2 in 1948, and 1 in 1949. Regarding to the first post-war period, we must recall one of the most infamous political trials, the Nagode trial, Nagodeto process, that unfolded between 29th of July and 12th of August 1947, as a result of which also 3 women were convicted. There is incomplete data on political arrests. We have some data regarding those who worked with British intelligence services during the war, and some even before the war, and were very active opponents of both Nazism and fascism. Among these were also some women, we don't know how many. Then, after the dispute between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, the Comintern of 1948, 535 Slovenian members were either convicted or administratively punished. On this, among them, there were 52 women. And then violence against nuns. A special chapter involves the post-war persecution of priests, monks, and seminarians. There were also more forms of persecution of female Catholic orders. Often, nuns were cursed in public, spit on, and even attacked. Since the authorities abolished the monasteries, there were many nuns left on the street. By 1948, almost all female Catholic orders in Slovenia were liquidated. Private schools, including Ecclesiastical, were closed, and the female teachers were dismissed. They were also dismissed from public social health institutions. Several nuns found themselves in courts, prisons, and labor camps. Experts on these issues conclude that there is insufficient data for a more thorough analysis. Okay. Now about the numerical data of violence against women and other civilians in the first post-war period from 1945 to 1947 in the Zone A. Or in other words, in the cities of Trieste, Gorizia, Monfalcone, and also in province of Udine. Here is the table for Trieste. The table contains figures of all cases of physical violence and also cases of death against members of pro-Yugoslav camp in Trieste from 12th of June 1945 to the end of 1947. Indexed are also the cases of physical violence against women and the women who died as a result of such violence. A lot of information was published by the then daily newspapers. The analysis was carried out by a group of researchers in the form of chronological examinations published in 1977 with the title Nazionalismo e neofascismo nella lotta politica al confine orientale. I completed the data and complemented them with documents held by archives in Belgrade, London, and the USA. Violence was mostly perpetrated by Italian neo-fascist and or extreme nationalist groups and partly by the civilian police of the Allied military government. Of course, we must add that some members of Italian neo-fascist and or extreme nationalist groups were active members of this police force. The most numerous are examples which occurred during special events. For example, in the spring 1946, when the city was visited by the Inter-Allied Boundary Commission, which had the task of establishing the ethnic composition of the area. Also around the 1st of May, in July 1946, and around the 15th of September 1947. It should be noted that most of the cases occurred in the center of the city, so we need a separate study on the situation in the surrounding villages. We must also consider that there were also some cases of violence against entire groups, not just individuals. So the number of persons who suffered from physical violence was certainly higher than these figures suggest. It was also likely that there were several cases of violence against women, as groups of children were also physically attacked, among which, I conclude, were also girls. Most of the victims of this violence were civilians. Only a few isolated cases involved members of the Yugoslav army. Finally, I should add that there were many other instances of violence in the given period caused by Italian neo-fascist and or extreme nationalist groups and partly by the Allied civil police. Among these were cases of gunfights, some included hand grenades, arsons, fights, and other. It should be added that, given the then frequent use of weapons and explosives, the number of deaths could have been much higher. Fortunately, most of the explosions caused only material damage. Indirectly, several other civilians suffered material damage, among these also women. At the same time, there were many other forms of physical as well as psychological intimidation. In other words, it is not excessive to say that violence was systematic. Here is the table for Gorizia. This introductory premises also apply to the following table of violence in Gorizia. Here, the violence against members of the pro-Yugoslav camp increased in 1946, and the peak was around the 15th of September 1947. Here is the table for Monfalcone or Tržić. It also applies to the premises to the coastal labor town of Monfalcone. Here, the violence against members of the pro-Yugoslav camp, especially the workers in the shipyard, began in February or March 1946, with a considerable increase and intensity after the summer and autumn of 1946, when it became clear in Paris that the free territory of Trieste will be established and Monfalcone will be returned to Italy. And also the table for Udine. The introductory premises also apply to the following table of areas in the Udine region. We ought to add here that previous research was less profound, so I do not rule out that the picture could change in the future. Of course, the basic fact is that the situation in this area was quite different from the situation in the Trieste, Gorizia and Monfalcone regions. So, the total, the table of total, if we look at the combined data on violence by Italian neo-fascist and or extreme nationalist groups, and partially by the civil police, let me repeat that it was also composed of some members of the Italian neo-fascist or extreme nationalist groups. So for the border area, which was left under Italian rule, the total numbers are the following: 530 physical violence, among them against 63 women, 19 personal deaths, among them 2 women. Okay. Following this review of political violence against women in the first post-war period, which is, of course, incomplete, let us take a closer look of both examples which stand out from the many violent acts we mentioned earlier. Both occurred in Trieste, first in the spring of 1946, the second in autumn of 1947. In both cases, one woman was violently murdered. We can say that the event from 1946 received some attention from historians, the second less. In March 1946, the circumstances were as follows. From Paris was sent the Inter-Allied Boundary Commission, which had the task of establishing the ethnic composition of the area. That is, the problem of the border. At the same time, in Zone A, the pro-Yugoslav camp was very opposed to the Allied military government, mainly because of education. The question is very complicated. I will go further. The question of Slovenian school was aggravated during preparations for the arrival of the Inter-Allied Boundary Commissions, and tensions were rising on the ground. On 7 March of 1946, the commission of experts arrived in Trieste, and 2 days later, a new incident arose. A prohibited flag was displayed in a Slovenian secondary school in Trieste, a Yugoslav flag. The civilian police broke into the school and arrested the students. The next day, on 10th of March, there was an even worse incident between pro-Yugoslav persons and the allied civilian police. In Servola, in Slovenian Škeden, the police demanded the removal of the Yugoslav flag on the church bell tower. It was brought to the attention of the allies from the diocese itself. So this flag from the church, which the people there tried to prevent. During the incident, members of the civil police fired in the crowd. 2 were killed, Giorgio Bonifacio and Giovanna Genzo, a mother of 3. 22 people were also wounded. From 11 to 13 of March, there was a large protest in Trieste against the events that unfolded in Škeden. Slovenian teachers also joined the protest together with their pupils. Consequently, the Allied military government ordered the temporary closure of Slovenian schools. On the pro-Yugoslav side, they launched campaigns against the civilian police. On the photo here, we see an elderly lady from the area of Trieste who is signing the resolution against the violence of the civil police the day after the shooting. As seen from the next photo, this photo, a funeral followed with which attract a large crowd. However, there exist different and very different numbers about the participants of the funeral. Different estimates were already made in the pro-Yugoslav camp. For example, from 80,000 as per la voce del popolo, as we see on the slide, to 150,000 as per Primorski Dnevnik, to even 250,000 people as per a pro-Yugoslav propaganda publication. In any case, we can say that the participation was considerable. In the media, however, they stressed even more that justice must be done, especially regarding the borders. After the events of March 1946, and particularly because of the Servola incident, the press in Yugoslavia was strongly against Great Britain and United States. The riot police received a lot of spotlight, and in general, civilian police was the prime enemy. So here is an example. May I say, the Allied military government police are carrying out a great deal of violence against the anti-fascist and democratic people of Trieste. This became a slogan which was also displayed in various publications, like here. The events of Škeden, also Servola, also echoed in the United States at the end of March 1946, when they appeared on the cover of the University of Michigan student magazine, the Michigan Daily. Above all, the emphasis was on the fact that Giovanna Genzo, the mother of 3, died during a demonstration against the withdrawal of the Yugoslav flag. And now about my second case study. In 1946 and 1947, Allied intelligence services captured some individuals who were very active in the pro-Italian circles and not just in propaganda. They were engaged in the amassing of weapons and the organization of paramilitary groups. Large consignments of weapons depots were also discovered. The data is interesting because in the example of another case which I have chosen to address, there is a lot more to the data than meets the eye. We are talking about the murder of a girl named Milka Vrabec, also known in the Italian version as Emilia Passerini. The circumstances were as follows. In the middle of September 1947, the peace treaty with Italy was due to be implemented, meaning that most of Zone A would return to Italy and the bulk of the Zone B would go to Yugoslavia. The most controversial part, that is the Trieste region and the northwestern part of Istria, would be transformed into a new state, the Free Territory of Trieste. The Anglo-Americans feared that the Yugoslavs would take this opportunity to send their soldiers to Trieste. It was, obviously, a Cold War confrontation, which, of course, had a broader meaning. Relations between the United States, the British, and the Soviets were becoming even more aggravated. For example, Truman's doctrine, the Civil War in Greece, and so on. If the situation was tense in 1946, it was even more so in 1947. The closer the date of the implementation of the peace treaty, the more intense it became, and the newspapers were full of news of the ever new violent incidents. I have addressed it in the first part of this paper. The predictions of Allied intelligence officers were that the situation was ripe for a dreadful, spontaneous incident. In such in that situation, in such a tense atmosphere, the bloody fact. On the evening of 13th of September, at around 11 p.m., a group of 5 young Italians shot with a machine gun in the direction of the garden of a Slovenian workers' educational club, where a ball was taking place. They killed an 11-year-old Milka Vrabec and wounded her companion, Wanda Jarman. A major massacre did not occur because the group's gun got jammed. On the following day, the pro-Yugoslav press highlighted that this was a political murder, that this was renewed political murder, and the population demands justice and freedom. The Primorski Dnevnik, the Slovenian daily, was even more categorical. The murder was committed by fascists or neo-fascists. On the same days, there were several more examples of violent acts, and as is also evident from the notes of the Partisans Associations, AMPI, which were sent to the Passerine family by Franco Ceccotti. You can see here some extracts of them on the slide. It is evident from the notes that neo-fascists threw several bombs, used knives, and they even used the same machine gun that killed Milka Vrabec and wounded Wanda Jarman. Both victims were labeled as compagna, meaning comrades. The pro-Italian press, however, presented an entirely different picture about the murder. This act ought to be condemned, of course, but it is a criminal act without affiliation. Another example, only criminals. The dichotomy in the interpretation continued in the following days. In general, two versions were immediately formulated. Ordinary crimes for some, for others a political murder, or as we see on the slide, that the terrible murder was caused by ugly chauvinistic groups. Sorry, it was important for the pro-Yugoslav press that our women, the Trieste mothers, had raised their voices. Okay, I cannot.
There's 5 minutes.
Oh. Okay, on 16th of September, the funeral attracted a large crowd that gathered on the streets. We can see in these photographs the many children and women standing around the coffin and so on. I have here some photos. I'm sorry, I have no time. This is the main streets in the center of Trieste. On 16th of September, and after the morning funeral, its participants continued with a big manifestation in support of the free territory of Trieste. The funeral of Mikkel Dack was therefore truly magnificent. However, there was no lack of heated comments by the pro-Yugoslavian press because the police had banned the inhabitants of nearby villages from attacking. The murder triggered a total The murder triggered a total labor strike on 15th of September. On that day, there were severe and violent riots which resulted in the deaths of 2 persons. A worker, Carlo Castagna, was stabbed while the 19-year-old Alino Conestabo died or was killed in unexpected circumstances. This marked the culmination of the mutual hatred of both groups for one another. And we can see, we can read in one of the then Yugoslav publications that the pro-Yugoslav camp again accused the city police, so the Allied military government, of blocking the Castagna funeral. So here I have documents from British archives, but I will go further. The pro-Italian press began to draw connections between the murders of Mikkel Dack and Alino Conestabo. Perhaps an attempt to relativize or an endeavor for peace, but was it so? The pro-Italian press began also to draw connections between the mothers of the 2 victims. On the day of the funeral of Conestabo, the 2 had apparently hatched one another. The mother of Mikkel Dack, on the right, they did this in the public, in the press. The pro-Yugoslav or pro-communist press engaged in solidarity with the Dack Pasolini family. A collection of contributions took place. Having been the mother of 3 other minors and having lived in very bad conditions, the mother of Milka also appealed to the editorial offices of pro-Italian newspapers. During the collection, other newspapers were also engaged. A new large-scale labor strike, which was linked to the Dack case, also took place. The situation remained ever so intense. It is likely that Milka murder case would not have received such attention if the suspects had not been arrested and the consequent trial had not happened. The day after the funeral, the first speculations about the arrest of some suspects appeared. In this regard, the communist newspaper Il Lavoratore categorically predicted the view of the pro-Yugoslav or pro-communist camp about the underperformance of justice. Therefore, an immediate threat ensued. Should the Allied military government not guarantee order and peace, the people will see to it. When the arrest was confirmed in the beginning of October, and 4 young Italians, the first was on the run at the time, so the 4 young Italians, the dichotomy of the press continued. Was the murder politically motivated or not? When the process continued at the end of November, the pro-Italian press tried to justify the attempts by the defense to prove the innocence of the suspects on the grounds of insanity and the fact that they were minors. The 4 suspects blamed the murder on the 5th member who was on the run. They called him Dogo. The pro-Yugoslav press insisted that there had to have been an organization that orchestrated the whole thing, and at the same time warned it that there was already talk of an acquittal. Then, the pro-Italian press speculated about the possibility of the Križari, the anti-communist Yugoslav group, being behind the murder. In the end, 3 were sentenced to 7 years in prison and 1 was acquitted. It is not difficult to imagine the differences in the reporting of the 2 press groups. The pro-Yugoslav side, of course, extremely disappointed. Due to the leniency of the convictions, a strike also occurred. There was no shortage of criticism of the justice of the Allies and of the Allied military government. Many protest letters were issued. For this reason, the Anglo-Americans felt obligated to publish a communiqué here, in which they announced that in order to maintain peace, they would fiercely oppose any form of fascism, be it white, red, or black. On the other side, the pro-Italian press advocated the punishment and, in general, respect for the judgment of the judiciary. Epilogue. Judicial epilogue. In January 1941, the first suspect was arrested in Padua. The one who was charged with having orchestrated the murder by his 4 accomplices. Contradictions arose again in court and elsewhere the following day. The opposing views were repeated, although a slight decrease in the intensity of reporting by the press is noticeable. He was sentenced to 5 years and 4 months in prison, despite being accused of having been the brains of the group. The violent events of March 1946 and September 1947 ultimately reached another different epilogue. On 1st of November 2005, a bilingual commemorative board was set up for Giovanna Genzo and Giorgio Bonifacio in Servola, Schkeden. On 9th of January 2006, the President of the Italian Republic awarded Alino Condestable with a commemorative medal for civil courage. There is some uncertainty about this. Prior to this, in 1977, the Italian Lega Nazionale dedicated a commemorative plaque in his honor. Relatives of Mikkel Dack tried in vain to achieve a memorial. So, in conclusion, both cases are paradigmatic about post-war violence. They contain essentially all the elements of one of the most intense periods of the history of Trieste and also of the wider Primorska region. In both cases, the circumstances were extremely tense, as both victims became, in a way, the victims of politicization in light of the greater, more impactful events that unfolded on a much greater scale. In both cases, a woman was at the forefront, for the first time, of course, as a victim, but also, as we see, for instance, in the photos, at protests and at funerals. At the same time, newspapers emphasizes that a mother of 3 had died in Schkeden or Servola in 1946, or that a mother had lost her child in September 1947. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Gorazd for this really detailed paper that opens a lot of questions in my opinion. And then I will give the floor to Mikkel Dack, who is Assistant Professor of History at Rowan University and Director of Research for the Rowan Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. His research focuses on psychosocial history, emotions, memory, and gender. His paper, the topic is Breaking the Silence, Denazifications and Violence Against German Women in the Post-War. Please, the floor is yours. 30 minutes, and maybe 2 or 3 minutes more.
Thank you for the introduction. I'd like to begin this my talk with an apology. I had a PowerPoint slides to show you, but they were not compatible with this computer. So so if you see me often like looking at the screen to change slides, you know why. Okay? So I apologize. Yeah, thank you. All right, so it's probably best I don't have the slides actually, because a lot of the images are quite disturbing, so I'm sparing you of that. But anyways, like my colleague, I'm going to divide my time today talking about two different things. First, I'm going to interpret the major historiographical trends and prospects of the study of violence against German women after the Second World War. I'd like to chart the relatively recent scholarship, isolate some of the more significant studies, and also recommend what I see as important historiographical interventions for the future study of violence against German women. Then I will briefly describe how violence against women has revealed itself in my own research. I studied the sexual violence and the rape of German women many years ago, and unexpectedly it has reappeared in my current book project. So I'd like to focus mainly on my methodological approach, but also share with some of my initial findings. And it really is my intention to highlight particular sources and methodologies that that speak to the larger theme of this workshop with hopes that it can lead to discussion. Let's change my slide here. So the study of violence against German women in the aftermath of the Second World War, a topic of inquiry that I believe is still very much in its infancy, has focused almost entirely on sexual violence and on crimes perpetrated by Soviet soldiers. Research on all other aspects of violence against women has been folded into the much larger study of violence against all Germans, mainly surrounding the wartime bombings and the forced expulsion from the East. But all research on violence against Germans, including sexual violence, has been governed largely by the question of, and this won't come as a surprise, how do we navigate the traditional but still popular binary understanding of the roles of victims and perpetrators? The rape of German women specifically defies essentialist definitions of victim and perpetrator. And it serves as a marker for evaluating the changing perception of Germans' historical roles in World War II. So because the only act of violence against German women that has been studied in isolation has been sexual violence, I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes talking about the historiographical trajectory over the last 75 years that has surrounded this topic. So a bit of background. When the Allied armies crossed the Oder and Rhine rivers, respectively, in February 1945, they encountered a Third Reich that mainly had a female face. In some towns, the ratio was 170 women to 100 men. And immediately upon their arrival, soldiers unleashed what historian Norman Neymark has called an unrestrained explosion of sexual violence. German women and girls were subjected en masse to a wide range of violence committed by Soviet, American, British, French, and other soldiers. But the Soviet rapes, to be clear, were by far the most prevalent and severe. Those who were victims of sexual violence suffered immensely. Many endured multiple violations and found themselves impregnated by their assailants, and thousands were murdered. To survive, some German women entered into a negotiated relationship of exchange, wherein sex was traded for protection and provision. Others were forced into prostitution. Sex between soldiers and enemy civilian women was a highly variable and morally ambiguous array of events. It occurred often within a complex sexual economy. Due to wartime conditions and individual and societal taboos, it is highly unlikely that historians will ever really know how many German women were in fact raped. The numbers are as low as in the tens of thousands, more likely in the hundreds of thousands, with some historians estimating that it was upwards of 2 million. And these rapes did not cease once the military surrender was signed in May 1945. They continued for an additional 4 years throughout the military occupation until Germany was divided in 1949 and the soldiers finally left. Women who were raped were often made into victims by their neighbors, clergy, doctors. Returning husbands did not want to talk about the rapes, and the restoration of the traditional family order in West Germany in the 1950s and the Soviet-endorsed workers' state in East Germany allowed little space for discussion. Historian Elizabeth Heinemann is correct in explaining that most women, after they had been raped, stood very much alone. Now, informal discussion about rape during the military occupation, so while these crimes were still occurring, was in fact quite common. However, the survivors themselves often used coded language. So, for example, in a 1948 town hall meeting in Berlin, which was organized to talk about the German relationship with the occupying Soviet soldiers, the word rape was not used. Instead, women spoke of having their bicycles stolen. This was code. While this informal and veiled conversation was widespread, there was very little formal discussion of rape or criticism in any of the occupied territories. The Soviet administration did very little to acknowledge the problem of rape. In fact, German women were often held responsible for the rapid spread of venereal disease. The military government justified the rapes as being a tragic but inevitable response to the crimes committed by Germans on the Eastern Front. So at the end of the occupation in 1949, the discussion of rape entered a long period of muffled talk. Because German women were clearly the wrong victims, so much of the story was silenced. But it did continue to be discussed only by the survivors at the ground level. The Cold War shaped the next 40 years of discussion on rape. With the return of POWs in the early 1950s and the remasculinization of German society, the topic was suppressed by both East and West German governments. It was seen as being too humiliating for German men and too risky for German women who feared the reaction of their men. Rape stories continued to circulate, just with less frequency. During the 1950s and 1960s, a very small group of writings did surface. I have in parentheses here. Two are pictured here. Let's see. But they were written almost entirely by men. They were in the form of war diaries, newspapers, editorials, and historical novels. And furthermore, almost all of these publications had a strong political subplot. American veterans condemned the Red Army for being, and I quote, barbarian rapists, and German expellees spoke of the invading hordes of lusting communists. The very few publications that did not have a clear political subplot, and there were some notable few, were written by survivors who expressed strong feelings of isolationism, helplessness, and they wrote about how neighbors did not come to their aid, and that they felt a general lack of solidarity among women. Still, these accounts were few and far between. Almost all published works were deeply imbricated in Cold War politics. They either protested the stories of rape as fascist capitalist propaganda, or they constructed German women as victims of communist Russians. Now, in the wake of the collapse of the German Democratic Republic and the Soviet Union and the gradual opening up of archives, the study of rapes became incredibly popular in the early 1990s. This was also provoked in part, as we know, by the sexual violence associated with the conflict of the former Yugoslavia. After decades of remarkable inattention, Red Army rapes became the subject of vigorous scholarly and feminist debates. But the rapes were first addressed in a public setting, beginning with Helke Zander's 1992 documentary film, Liberators Take Liberties, which examined the rape of German women committed by Soviet soldiers. The film ran in theaters for over a year and was broadcasted on television several times, and it was published in English too. Some scholars criticized the film for not sufficiently contextualizing the crimes, which in turn raised the larger question of whether German victimhood can even be addressed without simultaneously calling into remembrance the millions who were harmed or killed by the Germans themselves. It was also criticized for simplistically reducing the crimes to a binary opposition between the genders, depicting men as eternal rapists and women as their eternal victims. Original scholarly interpretation came soon after, when in around 1993, a very small group of scholars, who are now very prominent historians, argued that it was insufficient to merely document the crimes. They now also asked, how can we explain this greatest phenomenon of mass rape in history? And what were the historical consequences of these crimes? So standing out within this circle of scholars was Norman Neymark. I'm sure some of you are familiar with his 1995 book, The Russians in Germany. It included a long and daunting chapter that showed how the rapes committed by Soviet troops undermined the basis of East German government long before it existed. Equally important was Tina Grossman's 1995 article, A Question of Silence, in which she convincingly argued that in the aftermath of the war, there was no lack of speech or documentation about rape. And she points to the countless memoirs, oral histories, diaries, police and medical reports. So in doing so, she relinquished the long-held belief that the reason for this topic receiving so little attention in the past was because of the lack of citation. Grossman also successfully challenged the traditional interpretation of rape under military occupation, arguing that women reported extremely diverse experiences of what they variously called rape, coercion, violation, prostitution, or abuse. Sexual violence, in her words, was tragic and complicated. So the 1990s saw the introduction of the topic of sexual violence against German women to both public and scholarly audiences. Popular documentaries and articles were driven by the desire to expose the existence and the extent of the crimes, while the first wave of scholarship extended the source base and the historical purview by examining the motivations for the crimes and the legacies of rape. In all these studies, focus remained almost entirely on rape in the Soviet-occupied territories. So the turn of the millennium witnessed a surge of literature about German suffering and about the politics of memory in general. Dozens of authors rallied behind the claim that German victimization was never adequately expressed or recognized, and always overshadowed by the demand for recognition of collective guilt for Germany's crimes. So writing on German suffering soon became siloed into three discernible topics: the wartime bombings, the forced expulsions, and the Soviet rapes. And still to this day, it's hard to find really any conversation about German wartime or post-war suffering beyond these three categories. So new books, memoirs, articles, and documentaries on rape were written mainly by German, British, and American authors. And these publications, again, were presented as kind of an exposing record of long-forgotten crimes. Authors claimed that their research was introducing a topic into popular consciousness, that they were, quote-unquote, breaking the silence. Here we see titles such as The Forgotten Victims of World War II and The Diaries of the Neglected. So while first-hand accounts were incorporated into all of these studies, focus remained largely on the perpetrating soldiers and on calculating the number of women raped. So for example, English historian Anthony Beaver, his documentation of the Soviet rapes appeared in translation in 2002. It sold more than 6 million copies in its first year. And it's been since translated into, I think, 8 languages now. And in this very popular best-selling book, Beaver estimates that upwards of 2 million German women were raped. There are 110,000 in Berlin alone. And he also argues that while these rapes were never sanctioned from above by the Soviet military and political leadership, they were also never condemned. Beaver and other scholars in the early 2000s drew much of their interest and inspiration from the 2003 republished and anonymously written book, memoir, Eine Frau in Berlin. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this one. In this celebrated memoir, the author describes the capture of Berlin, the widespread rapes by Soviet soldiers, including her own, and the women's pragmatic approach to survival. When originally published in Germany in 1959, it was actually first published in English in the US, and then it was translated back into German, and there was some differences in the translation, which is controversial, but I won't get into that. But when it was published in Germany in 1959, the reviews were incredibly negative. It was either ignored or reviled. Some reviewers, I quote, said, "This book offends the honor of German women." And after these reviews, after this first publication run, the book more or less disappeared. Some photocopies were circulated, but we didn't hear much about it until the early 2000s. So it was during this resurgence of this conversation of German suffering during the Second World War and its aftermath that this book was republished and became a bestseller overnight. And really, since then, it's become a centerpiece source for all contemporary studies of post-World War II rapes, not just in Germany. In 2008, the memoir was adapted into a successful film, which reached a wider audience, and it has since inspired the writing and publication of other memoirs. Last count, I think there were 15 that have been published since this was re-released. The most famous by Gabriella Pope, which is the first non-anonymous diary published. But it should be noted that up until this point, so before 2010, research has remained almost entirely on rape in the Soviet-occupied territory. There had been very little about the Western Allied armies or the experiences of German women in the Western territories. And despite the enormous wave of publications in the early 2000s, only 2 works have reached a wider audience, both of which I've mentioned. So first was the Helga Sanders documentary film, Liberators Take Liberties, and this wartime memoir, Eine Frau in Berlin, Women in Berlin. And again, both of these popular studies focused only on Red Army soldiers. So entering into the last decade of research, according to my own reading of the most recent literature, there are two current avenues of research on this subject, and I hope this resonates with your own research and what we talked about today. The first is exposure, or discovery, once again. Remembering the rape of German women has proven to be schizophrenic. On the one hand, the rapes have been an assumed part of the collective narrative of war's end, a well-known fact that, while suppressed in public discussion, has been alive in private circles. On the one hand, the repeated discovery of the rapes, particularly the extent of the rapes, continually registers shock among historians and the public alike. The desire to expose the truth has remained a strong force for about 3 decades now. That being said, these discovery publications are not all redundant. For example, one important inroad has been recent research on the rape of German women in the Western territories by American, British, and French soldiers. Most notable is the 2015 book, which was translated to English in 2017, originally published in 2015, by Miriam Gebhardt, which was translated with the title Crimes Unspoken. And the stated goal of Gebhardt's research is to, and I quote, break the impenetrable barrier of silence. So drawing largely from first-hand accounts and police reports, Gebhardt, in her words, exposes rape by the democratic liberators. And she estimates that close to 200,000 women were raped by Western Allied armies. She comes to this number by using figures from the Federal Statistics Office in 1956, and also by calculating the number of occupation children. So this is an important study despite the fact that it uses the same sources and in some cases makes the same claims as earlier scholars. To be clear, this is not the first time historians have examined rape in the Western occupied territories. But it is the first time that this knowledge has reached a popular and international audience. This book has been translated in many languages already. It's received a lot of press. But still, Gebhardt's message, in my opinion, is at times a bit too forceful. She does recognize the Soviets perpetrated the majority of these crimes, but loses touch with the fact that while the experience of rape was similarly violent and tragic no matter where it occurred in occupied Germany, women in the Eastern Territories shared an experience for the most part unknown to women in the West. That is, the ubiquitous threat and reality of rape over a prolonged period of time. Studies such as Gebhardt's that repeatedly discover the crimes surely continue to be published and be adapted for a wider audience. For example, a few weeks ago, this editorial ran in the Canadian newspaper, the National Post, and they said that this is made the front page of the most popular newspaper in Canada, saying that they've exposed the rapes by Canadian soldiers. This is just a few weeks ago. So this kind of literature, making the rapes visible, is still very popular. But meanwhile, scholarly research has moved beyond the exploratory but still important phase of research. They produce more nuanced studies on this subject. So for example, the second promising avenue of research in this regard is in relation to the shorter and longer term consequences of the rape, specifically as they relate to German politics, national identity, and the individual and family. Most promising perhaps is the study of trauma, which you've heard a lot about already today, particularly recovery from post-traumatic stress. For example, Martina Bomar's recent study on trauma therapy in nursing homes for German women who experienced sexual violence during the occupation. Similar research has been conducted by psychologists Svenja Eichhorn and Philipp Koivert as part of a special research project based at the University of Greifswald. Both experiments study the long-term effects of post-war rape on mental health and the willingness of German women to reconcile with their assailants. All of these studies highlight the necessity for prevention and treatment programs for women exposed to wartime rapes in current conflict settings, or in worldwide, and the need to identify and treat post-traumatic conditions in the elderly generation of all countries exposed to World War II trauma. So what we'll certainly see in the future, and what we're seeing here today, I guess, with this workshop, is the willingness to compare historical acts of sexual violence from different countries, different conflicts, different time periods. I think this is incredibly important. To conclude my comments on the historiography, the ultimate problem in studying the rape of German women, and I'm sure many of you can relate to this, the problem is that while some scholarship has been criticized for not providing enough historical context for the crimes, mainly some feminist studies, other studies apply arguably too much context to the point that they ignore the individual experience and remove the human agency of the victim and the accountability of the perpetrator. This is a fundamental dilemma that I believe will continue to govern research on this subject for years to come. It is also my hope that discussion of violence against German women will expand to include experiences beyond rape. Millions of German women were physically abused and many were murdered by invading and occupying soldiers. These experiences were in some ways distinct from the experiences of German men, yet they have not really been examined in any meaningful way. So, just in the time that I have left, in 5 minutes or so, I'm going to, if I have the time.
Yes, yes, you have.
Okay, I'm going to say a few things about my current research project and how this topic has surfaced. Like I said, very unexpectedly. Okay, so although I'm still compiling my data, in the end, ultimately, one chapter in my forthcoming book will examine how the memory of violence interplayed with denazification and how it affected post-war lives in Germany. This chapter is concerned mainly with women because, interestingly enough, women were much more likely than men to record, to communicate experiences of violence. Let me explain how that unfolded. So for the invading Allied armies, denazification acted as a kind of an overall single term to contain various policies that were intended to cleanse, it's the word of the occupiers, cleanse Nazism and militarism from the entirety of German society. It was quite easy to determine what it meant to arrest leaders and to take down, Nazi symbols, street signs, but it was much more difficult, really a daunting and complex task to identify who was a genuine Nazi or a sympathizer, and how to remove them from office or from a position of influence, whether it was political, economic, or social, cultural. Furthermore, by 1945, about 8.5 million Germans had joined the Nazi Party, whether by conviction, opportunism, or force of circumstance. So the question asked by Allied armies when they arrived in Germany was, on what basis could such a determination be made? How can we figure out who was a Nazi and who wasn't? And I don't need the slide here because I actually have an original copy. I promise this was not stolen from the archives. This is they decided on a questionnaire, if you believe it. A self-administered questionnaire distributed to all Germans who wanted to obtain employment or retain their job as a civil servant or in the private sector in a managerial position. And each of the four occupiers had different versions of the questionnaire. The Americans and the British wrote the original one that the French and the Soviets used to and adapted. But this is really kind of, we hear about denazification, we hear about the Nuremberg trials or blowing up swastikas, but in fact it was really this bureaucratic undertaking, this distribution, collecting, and processing questionnaires that composed the vast majority of resources when it came to denazification. So, although there were some differences between zones, generally speaking, if you wanted to retain your job or retain a job, you had to complete one of these forms, and it would be cross-referenced with salvaged and seized Nazi Party records to see if you were telling the truth about your affiliation with the regime. So there were standardized questions in this form, such as about your personal identity, what is your permanent address, what is your religion. Also questions regarding political affiliations and military history. Were you ever a member of the NSDAP? That was a big one, of course. And have you ever rendered military service in 1919? And there were caveats at the top, printed at the top of each version of the questionnaire, explaining that if the respondent omits information or submits false information, that he or she will be tried by a military tribunal and punished upwards of 5 years in prison. And many Germans were. So these questionnaires acted as the cornerstone of all Allied denazification efforts, and as many as 20 million were distributed. So all likelihood making this the largest survey in history. It was a massive undertaking. But this was not a typical questionnaire. This is where the topic of violence comes into play. And that is that Germans who completed this questionnaire were allowed to append documents to it. They could write commentaries about their lives under the Third Reich and of their lives currently living under occupation. And what is interesting, something I did not expect when I went to the archives, was to see that thousands of Germans, I looked at a sample size of 8,000, thousands of Germans, men and women, wrote at length about violence and how they had been victim to some form of violence either during the Third Reich or during the immediate post-war period at the hands of an occupation soldier. So what I have in my possession then, what remains in the archives, is this incredibly large repository of first-hand autobiography. and many of which contain these long-winded, emotion-driven commentaries about one's life. So like all autobiographical sources, this questionnaire, or in German, the Fragebogen, possesses significant biases, of course, and therefore its content should be read with some skepticism. Presumably, most respondents wrote about acts of violence committed against them to better their chances of securing gainful employment. They presented stories of hardship to elicit some kind of sympathy from the occupation forces and to express that because they had been victimized, they had never been committed Nazis. So this is how I interpret this source, as kind of a forced act of recollection and as an ego document with performative features. My analysis therefore draws largely from narrative psychology, which is concerned with the storied nature of human conduct. And leading theorists in this field maintain that if written words are deliberately inauthentic, they can be extremely convincing to the author, so much so that they can cause the narrative and the historical action itself to act as one and the same semantic structure. That being said, when it comes to stories of hardship, especially abuse and sexual violence, we cannot assume that most of the written responses were fabricated or even exaggerated. This is because most Germans knew the consequences. They were well aware of the consequences of lying on their questionnaires. And furthermore, it was unclear that that there be any kind of benefit from including these stories in your questionnaire. This was not well known. My research also considers how the act of recording stories of physical violence affected the mental health of German women. While most models for trauma recovery state that it is beneficial to verbalize or communicate in some way the traumatic experience, they also state that the survivor must first create intimate connections with people in their lives and rebuild basic capacities for trust. Furthermore, recovery from trauma is based upon the survivor's sense of personal empowerment, autonomy, and safety. So this act of forced recollection, in order to keep your job, and not to mention within a context of military occupation and fear, this is really not a suitable context for recovery from trauma. So although composing a majority of the German population after the war, upwards of 60%, women represented a minority of questionnaire respondents. My guess is around just less than 15%. Because denazification targeted mainly managerial positions and jobs of political, economic, and cultural influence. After the war, most women were either employed in non-managerial positions in the private sector or carried out unofficial work as homemakers and therefore were not subjected to denazification. Denazification, just like the military occupation itself, was a highly patriarchal system. That is not to say that women were exempt from denazification proceedings. Millions of female civil servants, mostly teachers, nurses, and secretaries, were required to complete questionnaires. So let me just give you a snapshot of my findings before I conclude. I reviewed a total of 8,000 questionnaires for my book project. But for today, I'm going to talk about the first 2,000 that I've interpreted the data from. And they're from all 4 zones, so the American, the British, the French, and the Soviet zones. So within this simple random sample of 2,000 denazification questionnaires, completed by men and women, 360, and by the way, I had all these numbers up on the screen so they'd be a lot easier to digest. But of the 2,000 respondents, 360, so about 18%, were women. And nearly all of these questionnaires included some kind of commentary. The average age of the female respondent was 32, and the majority were filled out in the American zone. Of these 360 women in my sample group, 226, so 63%, recorded at least one experience of violence or general hardship that they had endured in the final months of the war or in its immediate aftermath. Some mentioned violence only in passing. Others wrote long and detailed descriptions of what they had been through and how it had impacted their lives physically and emotionally. Now, of these 226 respondents, 165 described how they had been physically assaulted, either by a fellow German, a refugee, a displaced person, or an occupation soldier. And of these stories of violence, 226 stories of violence, 22 recorded instances of sexual violence. That's 6% of all female respondents. An interesting point here is that almost all respondents implicated a soldier from another zone. So for example, one of the respondents was raped in the Soviet-occupied sector of Berlin, but recorded the details in a questionnaire she completed in British-occupied Hamburg, where she had moved. In fact, for my sample group, only 2 respondents accused a soldier from the same zone in which they completed the questionnaire. A few A few examples from this random sample. This comes from a German woman in the British zone speaking about violence at the hands of a Russian soldier. I quote, "All of our belongings were taken by a gang of communist soldiers. One hit me and my sister." This was filled up. This was recorded by a French zone woman speaking about violence by another German. Herr S., a well-known Nazi, entered our home and threw me to the ground. He knew that my husband was an anti-fascist. This was recorded in the U.S. zone, talking about your Russian soldier. They, the Soviet soldiers, were angry and drunk. 4 of them violated me. And finally, this is recorded in the French zone, speaking about rape by an American soldier. I was abused by him, and after it was done, he threatened my life. So let me conclude with a few remarks about what this tells us. And I'm still, again, interpreting this data for the book. First, my research confirms that survivors of rape and other acts of sexual violence were not silent after the war, at least in these early months. Many German women were willing to recount and record instances in which they had been physically abused by occupation soldiers. But that being said, they only felt comfortable doing so if they were not living among the soldiers who had perpetrated the violence, and this is understandable. But interestingly, they also felt safe enough to accuse fellow Germans of physical abuse and sexual violence who lived in their community. In fact, some respondents asked the military government to arrest the soldiers who they alleged had abused them. This further complicates the relationship between the occupier and the occupied. Second, many German women saw denazification as an opportunity to communicate their experience of violence, and perhaps used these experiences to improve their chance of obtaining or retaining employment. Stories of violence, including rape, were used as political and economic currency. This also likely contributed to the community of victimhood that was already developing in Germany after the war. It served to avoid confrontation with Nazi crimes, but also had the effect of politicizing the violence that these women had endured. And finally, I should mention that there is no indication that the Allied armies followed up on any of these accusations made against soldiers or Germans. None of the 22 rape accusations were pursued. And you can speculate why that is. But to conclude, in a recent interview with Der Spiegel, a historian claimed that research on the topic of violence against German women after the Second World War has come too late to conduct interviews, and this is true. But there exist millions of denazification questionnaires, and likely tens of thousands of first-hand accounts about violence against women, including rape. So this research introduces a new wealth of primary source material and provides a voice to millions of German women. Thank you.
Thanks a lot also for this really detailed, and I think it opened a lot of questions about what happened in Germany after the Second World War. And okay, I open immediately the discussion. How many time we have until the break?
5.
Okay.
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. Matteo?
I have a question for Gorazd about the use of the body of the victims. I saw in the pictures that they exposed the body and of the girl in particular, and of course it's a time where we have a lot of photos of the events. You saw beautiful pictures, beautiful in the tragedy, but have you seen the same in the funeral of the man, where the body was so exposed to the public and to the public opinion in particular?
Thank you, Matteo. I have to say that I had big fortune, but I was really fortunate because the family of Mikkel Dack gave me the private legacy, and in that private legacy there are a lot of photos and a lot of newspapers clipping. I never see that the same for the other victims like here. I asked them why the little girl, Emilia Brabec, at the funeral, she had the eyes, open eyes. It was terrible. That was the trauma for the family till now, and probably never end. Then I have no other data about it. I don't know why they put the open eyes.
Thank you both for two excellent talks. I'm afraid I have two specific questions. So two questions. First Gorazd and then Mikkel. So I totally understand if you cannot or will comment on it. I would like to come back to this issue of the nuns and how they were treated, because one thing that I was missing this morning, there seems to be also a hierarchy of what kind of woman to be assaulted. I mean, the most damage you can do with unspoiled territory, which is a virgin. So the iconography of virginity, I missed this morning next to the iconography of motherhood. And I encountered, so I was just wondering whether you could comment on the fact that that the religious framework was just a framework, but they just wanted to have unspoiled women, because I came across records in Graz with the Red Army specifically looking for nuns. And we have that later on, so they either raped very young women where they knew they were virgins and didn't suffer from VD, or very old women because all the young women had already been raped. So I was wondering whether you encountered anything in your files in that case or in that respect. And for Mikkel, I was wondering, we come back to the issue of class that Tullia addressed earlier. I mean, these women applying for the few managerial jobs, they were certainly not really representative. I mean, they were a particular demographic group. So I don't know whether your an analysis or study is also contrasted, but could you find any differences between reports by other women and also I mean, this is just another comment. I mean, they had in a way some sort of niche to express themselves. Because you mentioned Miriam Gephardt, she contextualized especially Red Army rapes, especially with the Cold War. So after the Cold War, it seemed to be much more easier in a way to address that. But these women, in this way, I refrain from using the word elitist, but they were a very specific group, and they were also. This is again a striking aspect that harks back to this morning's session. What Anna mentioned, you have to be physically removed from where it happened, and then you can start talking about it. So these are maybe two specific questions.
I have no data about that. I don't know if there any research about that. There are some studies here in Slovenia by some Slovenian historians about the problem of the relations between the state and the church after the Civil War, especially Tamara Gisler-Pečar. We have it's very interesting book about the Bishop Våg, and there we find some data about that, but I don't know if there are specific research about that.
Thank you, Dagmar. Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely class plays an important role here. Although it wasn't just managerial positions that these women were applying for. A lot of them were just regular, like they were employed. But being employed means something in itself, because the majority of women were not employed after the war. But yeah, they were often if you worked in the Reichsbahn office or something like that, doing whatever work, you still had to complete a questionnaire. So there were some. It wasn't just the elite, working class, or workers, but yeah, but because the majority of women were not working in these positions, or working at all, I don't have any data on them whatsoever, because they did not complete a questionnaire. Unfortunately, denazification, many women kind of flew under the radar of it because it was this economic purge. Just your comment about being physically removed from the violence in order to be able to talk about it. That's what I found over and over again. Like I said, there were only two instances where soldiers were pointed out as who were in that Kreis, that region. And in one case, it was in the Soviet zone, and the rank was given of the soldier. Like, there were no names, but the rank was given. and distinct features with hopes that that soldier would be punished. But there's no follow-up. In fact, the comment made was circled in red by the soldier who, or the denazification officer who reviewed it. But there's no commentary on what happened thereafter. But yeah, absolutely, it had to be removed. That's what I found.
Actually, I don't have a question, but a comment on your first question, Dagmar. I was thinking about a memory of mine own when I was a teenager in the 90s, and it refers to the nuns and the question of silence, because I remember I was raised in this, how to say, I was a part of a Catholic circle. I was going to, as a teenager, I was still visiting this one week sessions at, in our town, and it was really, this memory accompanied me through all my life, because we were reading in the 90s, in the time of happening, a letter of a nuns from a monastery from Bosnia telling the story of rape. It was, we knew as teenagers that something's going on in Bosnia, that there's a war, there's a lot of happening, but there was a specific kind of, they were really telling their pain, they have to suffer because they were raped, and what to do because they were nuns and supposed to be pure, and they are going to have a child which they cannot, of course, rid of. That was not, and it was really a heavy thing for a teenager to digest, but a memory that still. Because we were talking about the silence in that period, and it was really in the 90s.
Do you have to say something? Now, if I may jump in just a moment about the question of nuns and rape nuns, I think in Vatican's archives we have a lot of sources about it, because it happens always. And it's also in the past centuries, and it's also can be considered a rape of the religion. It's a question of religion also. You have to link it not only to the, as Dagmar said before, and I agree with her, nuns are sure as healthy women for these reasons, but also because they represent religion. And in the past, the first, you have to go back to the period of the invasion of Turks and so on. Nuns were always raped. It's a long-lasting tradition, unfortunately. And in Vatican's archives, we have a lot of such data. I think that you could find information about it if you know I don't remember the order. L'ordine, the order of belonging of these nuns, for instance. Sorry for the...
Thank you both, Gorazd and Mikkel, for your very interesting presentations. I have a question to Mikkel, which is also open to Anna and Nena, if I may. I was wondering if you ever came across any literature investigating a situation where rape was a widespread practice and the impact that it had on the countries of origin of perpetrators. So what did happen to this man once they came back home?
I haven't, no. There's nothing about that. There's, you mean like a perpetrator who is not from that territory?
Yeah.
No, there's many cases, not enough, but many cases where soldiers were prosecuted and some executed for rape, and and that's not just for the Soviets. You see that the French, the British, Americans, Canadians. But for example, the Americans only are 500 trials. I think in Canada there's something like 50, and of course much more widespread than that. And even and those soldiers that went to trial, very few of them were actually prosecuted. Were actually served any time. I think in the American zone, the longest prison term was so it was a 10-year sentence, and he only served 2 years. And that's from the whole army during the occupation. That's the most severe punishment.
I wanted to also ask, I was really stunned by the similarity across space and time between your story and what happened in Kosovo, this silence that is not really silence, and also in Italy. I mean, remember we're talking about Monte Cassino, the rapes by the North African troops in Italy. And I said nobody knew about that, but it was a film that won the Oscar in 1960. It was just about that. So, and it's like Eirene in Holland. Everyone. There was even a trial in the 50s about the massacre of Jews in Eirene, but then nobody knows. Anyway,
Silence it never was, right?
That's a public secret. This is the elephant in the room. This is something that everyone knows, and yeah. But I want to know also how do you correct for the inherent bias of this that they show in the fact that the women always accuse soldiers from another zone, which may not mean that this violence didn't happen, but they may cover violence happen in the zone where they apply for a job, and then to you, I want to answer your question. I don't know which one.
No, I was wondering about the impact of
yeah, this is a fact. If we could find really studies on perpetrators, and they would be fabulous, or do studies on perpetrators. If you read the amazing material that comes out of the Hague on the trials against the Serbian military and political leaders, you find that they were very aware that was happening. There are minutes of meetings, but of course these meetings happen after the trials in Bosnia. So this Milosevic says, no, that can happen. We need to punish the perpetrators, and then nothing happens so they leave. Serbian military and political leaders leave a paper trail of compliance with international law. But then when the investigators went to check the military courts activities, there isn't a single trial for anything the Serbian soldiers did against Albanians. All the trials, there are thousands of prosecutions, thousands of Serb soldiers, and they're all for crimes committed against the army itself. So desertion, non-compliance with orders, and there's one case of rape against a Serb civilian woman, and no conviction.
Should I respond quickly? Discovering these commentaries, these stories of sexual violence really came as a shock to me. I didn't expect to see. Maybe the odd questionnaire had an appended Lebenslauf of some sort, but I was surprised when I kept seeing it over and over again, and I still don't really understand it, because there's no indication in the instructions for denazification like that. Why would respondents think that this would help their case? Something I didn't mention in my presentation is that it was more likely, if you were to reiterate a story of violence, it was more likely that you were in fact a Nazi. So you were trying to present yourself. Yes, I joined the party in 1935, but look what happened to me since. Like my house was destroyed. This Red Army soldier did this to me and my family, and therefore, I'm very much a victim, not a perpetrator, right? But later on in the British zone, it's the only zone I can find evidence of this. It was well known that in order for you to get your job back, you had to not just prove that you were a Nazi, but you had to prove that you had resisted the regime to the extent that you had suffered. And so in the British zone after 1946, you see many more stories about violence and personal suffering. So, but to answer your question, I don't. I'm not looking for statistics in my study per se. I recognize it as a biased source and we won't know what's true and what's false and what's manipulated. More importantly, I'm sure a lot of these respondents were in fact they experienced violence. Most women did, but it may have been, you know, little things changed in their story, but we'll never know. But I recognize that I read it more as a performative document. Yeah.
First, thanks for a very excellent, interesting presentation. And first question is for Gorazd. We have more data about the statistic about the victim of violence actions, because in the case, I make this example. In the case of the Untitled process, we have 3 victims, but 2 are 2 feminists, Paula Kochevar and Angela Godet. And the question, I think, of the class, but also the generation, age is very important. And this is the second, the link or the connection between the narrative and the age. Because I think that in both cases, the position during the war, in the case of the Gorazd, the women who are partisans, the women who are deeply involved in the resistance movement, determined also this position after the war in front of the other fighting part. And I don't know what happened in Germany regard the question of the age, because, okay, I read a lot about the very young generation as Grass and others, but I don't know what happened with the female part of German society, and after, naturally, about the discourse about the violence.
Thank you so much. I know that it will be very interesting to take into account that information or data. I think it's very interesting for the Untitled process and Paula Kochevar and Vodet, the published sources about that trial. There are a lot of things, but in a paper it's impossible to say everything. May I say just a little thing about the movies and books about the violence, rapes perpetrated by Allied soldiers. We have no studies for the situation in Trieste and Gorizia. It's no studies. There are no studies. Let's go to start. Okay.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, age definitely mattered in denazification. It didn't necessarily have a gender element to it, but in 1947, all 4 occupation zones, they passed the youth amnesty. So if you were under the age of 18 when you joined these organizations, Nazi organizations, then you were amnestied. And in addition to that, even before this amnesty was enacted, if you were a member of the Hitler Youth or the German Girls League, then they weren't considered automatic arrest or dismissal categories. So you could have been a troop leader in the Hitler Youth. You still will likely keep your job. You're often categorized as a midlife, a fellow traveler, or like someone who is seen as kind of just being a follower. But as far as age goes, I think that's all that really came up in my research.
Okay, I think if there are others, maybe, or if we haven't, we have coffee break. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the